Amaka, Nnenna, what are you two still doing in your room? It's 7:30. Time to leave for school. Mrs. Okorie, Amaka and Nnenna's mother, knocked on the door to their room. She opened the door and peeped inside. Amaka was tucking in her school uniform, while Nnenna was putting on her shoes. It's 7:30, girls. Time for school, she told them again. We are almost done, Mommy. We are coming, Amaka and Nnenna replied. Mrs. Okorie nodded and closed the door. She went back into the kitchen to pick up their food flask and water flask. She took them to the sitting room where she sat down to wait for Amaka and Nnenna. 5 minutes later, Amaka and Nnenna came out from their room, fully dressed and ready for school. Mrs. Okorie stood and smiled at them as they approached her. She kissed them on their foreheads and hugged them tightly to herself. Then she gave them their food flask and water flask, and she said to them, "Remember, look left and look right, then look left again before you cross the road." "Yes, Mommy, we know, Mommy," they replied. She smiled. "I know that you know, but I still have to remind you every day. That's what mothers are for. Also, don't enter an empty bus. Make sure there are people in the bus before you get into it." Amaka and Nnenna smiled at their mother. "Mommy, if you give us 1 naira for all the times you have repeated these instructions every day, we would be millionaires by now." Their mother smiled back at them. "Don't worry. You will both be mothers someday, and you will do the same thing that I am doing." Amaka and Nnenna said, "No, we won't be like this, oh. You are too protective, Mommy. But that's why we love you." Mrs. Okorie's heart swelled up with love for her girls. She hugged them and wished them a wonderful day at school. Then she stood at the door watching them as they walked down to the junction to get a bus. Mrs. Okorie said a silent prayer to God to protect her children and keep them safe from harm. Amaka and Nnenna were twins, and they were now 13 years old. They were SS1 students at Owerri Girls Secondary School, Owerri. And if not that they started complaining, Mrs. Okorie would have still been taking them to school and bringing them back every single day. Mrs. Okorie remembered the last time she took them to school. They were in JS3, about to write their junior secondary school certificate examination. Immediately after that exam, and they passed and were promoted to SS1, they told her to stop taking them to school. She wasn't happy about it, but they insisted, so she had to stop. They told her that they were no longer babies. She laughed and replied that they would always be her babies, even when they were 50 years old. That was the last time she took them to school. Now, all she could do was to pray for God's protection over them. Mrs. Okorie kept looking at them until she could no longer see them. Then she closed the door and went to get ready for her work. When Amaka and Nnenna said goodbye to their mother, they began to walk to the junction to take a bus to school. As they walked, Amaka told Nnenna about a boy in their street who was asking her out. Nnenna was surprised. "Which of them? And what's his name?" she asked Amaka. Amaka smiled shyly. His name is Emeka. He lives just after Mama Nkechi's compound. Nnenna searched her brain to check if she knew any Emeka, but she didn't. I don't know any Emeka that lives after Mama Nkechi's compound, she said. How did you two meet? Amaka kept smiling. It was that Saturday Mommy sent me to buy akara and pap from Mama Nkechi. He saw me and we talked. That was the first time we talked. Then we continued talking anytime I went to buy something. Nnenna smiled at her sister and told her that they would continue the discussion after school. Amaka and Nnenna got to the junction and stood to wait for an empty bus. Few minutes later, a bus stopped for them, but there was only one seat left. The bus conductor asked them to lap each other, but they refused. The conductor hissed and told them that they were not ready to go to school yet. Then he zoomed off. Amaka and Nnenna stood there, flagging down different buses. But for one reason or another, none of the buses stopped for them. Nnenna and Amaka decided to walk the distance to their school. Their school was quite far, but they believed it was better to start walking than to keep standing at a spot waiting for a bus that would never come. As they walked, it didn't take long before another bus stopped for them. In that particular bus, there were 10 passengers. 2 men were sitting on the last row behind. There were 3 women sitting in the middle row. There was a driver in the front. There were 2 men sitting in the driver's seat beside the driver in the front. And there was the bus conductor who was perching by the door of the bus. Amaka and Nnenna entered the bus and sat beside the 3 women in the middle row. Then the driver started driving. Few minutes later, one of the men sitting behind asked the man sitting next to him, "Guy, what's in this big bag you are carrying on your lap? Put it in the boot now so that there will be space here. You are inconveniencing me." The man he was talking to didn't respond to him. He asked the question again, but the man he was talking to didn't respond again. He asked the question the 3rd time, but the man still didn't respond. He got angry and forcefully took the bag from the man. Both of them started struggling for the bag. In the process of the struggle, the bag spilled open and bundles of dollar notes scattered on the ground. The man who started the trouble screamed, "I said it! I knew it! I knew he was a thief! I knew it was a thief that was sitting beside me." He held the owner of the bag on his shirt. "Where did you get the money? Who did you steal the money from? You must tell me who you stole from so that I can return the money." He held the owner of the bag tightly and refused to let him go. By then, other passengers, including Amaka and Nnenna, were watching the drama unfolding in the bus. The owner of the bag started begging the other man, "Please, please, I stole the money from my master. My master is a wicked and stingy man. I served him for 5 years in his business. When it was time to settle me and set up my own shop, he said he didn't have money. He asked me to wait for another year before he could settle me. That was why immediately he traveled to China to buy goods. I stole all the money in his safe. Don't worry, I will give you some money from it. Both of us can enjoy the money. But don't take me back to my master, please." The other man asked him, "How much will you give me so I can keep my mouth shut?" The thief thought about it for a few seconds and said, "I will give you $5,000, Oga." Immediately, the passengers who were watching the drama heard that the other man would be giving $5,000. Everybody started shouting, asking for their own $5,000. There was commotion in the bus. In all this, Amaka and Nnenna were quietly watching what was going on. They did not say one word. Unknown to the passengers, the drama between the two men arguing over money was a ploy, because while everybody was shouting and asking for their own share of the dollars, the driver quietly changed the direction he was driving to and headed towards the outskirts of Owerri. By the time the commotion died down and the bus was finally quiet, the driver had driven the bus into the deepest part of the forest. When the passengers realized this, another round of shouting and screaming started. Everybody was scrambling to come down from the bus, but the conductor kept the door closed. It was pandemonium. Passengers were pushing and kicking one another. Some were trying to jump out through the window. There was chaos everywhere. Amaka looked at her sister Nnenna. There was enormous fear in her eyes, but Nnenna held her hands and squeezed it, trying to assure her that all would be well. The conductor, who had closed the door, opened it. Then some passengers tried to jump out. He brought out a can of tear gas and announced that anyone who tried to jump down from the bus would have tear gas sprayed on him. That information seemed to penetrate their minds, because everyone sat back on their seats and became quiet. The driver, who was standing close to the conductor, asked the two men who had been arguing about the bag of money earlier to come down from the bus and bring the bag of money along. They came down and shook hands with the driver. The driver opened the pigeonhole in the van and brought out 4 bundles of 500 naira notes. He gave 2 bundles each to the two men. The two men thanked him and walked away into the forest. The passengers were extremely shocked as they realized that the argument the two men had about the money had been a decoy to distract them and divert their attention. The passengers once again began to scream, trying to jump out from the bus. The conductor sprayed the tear gas into the van and moved back. Immediately, there was shouting, screaming, and crying as the passengers rubbed their eyes. Amaka and Nnenna closed their eyes and held each other as they waited for the effect of the tear gas to pass. Few minutes later, when the tear gas had evaporated from the atmosphere, the conductor opened the door and asked the passengers to come down one by one. When they came down, he opened a small bag and asked them to drop all their phones, wristwatches, jewelries, and any gadgets into the bag. Amaka and Nnenna were the youngest people in the van. They were also the only students in the bus. All this while, they were thinking of how to escape from these strange men. When it was their turn to come down from the van, Amaka held her sister's hands and they came down together. Then Amaka approached the conductor and said, "Sir, we are late for school. We need to go to school. Our teachers and classmates will be wondering where we are." The conductor looked at Amaka from her head to her toes and licked his lips lasciviously. He smiled and held her jaw. Then he said, "Small girl, you know you are fresh meat. How can a man like me see fresh meat and refuse to eat? Don't worry, when I finish eating you, you will go back to school. Amaka shook with terror at the predatory look in his eyes. His eyes were full of evil, and Amaka knew there and then that she and Nnenna needed to start planning their escape. When every passenger had come down from the van, the conductor made them line up in a single line, and they started walking deeper into the forest. By then, the only noise that could be heard was the noise of the birds and the trees. The city of Owerri was far, far behind them. The passengers walked for almost 1 hour before they came to a tiny house. It was an uncompleted building located in the heart of the forest. The driver and the conductor led them into the house and asked them to sit down. The conductor went inside another room in the house and returned with packs of water, which he shared to the passengers. The passengers, who were tired and thirsty, thanked him and gulped down the water. Some of them lay down on the ground and slept off, while some were too afraid to close their eyes. As Amaka sat beside her sister Nnenna, all she could think of was how they were going to outsmart the conductor and escape. The conductor had very sharp eyes, and he was quick on his feet. It would take some genius idea to outsmart him. Amaka wanted to tell him that she and her sister wanted to use the toilet, and then they would escape from there. But she knew that such tactics would not work on the conductor. One thing she noticed was that the conductor seemed more in charge than the driver. It seemed that the conductor was the leader of the group. The driver was an elderly man who could be in his 40s, and he had the look of a father. Amaka didn't know why, but somehow she knew the driver was a father. So she decided that she would approach him when the conductor was not around. She would approach him and appeal to his conscience as a father. Amaka whispered her plan to Nnenna, who agreed that it was a solid plan. Nnenna told Amaka that she would try to distract the conductor so that it would be easier for Amaka to speak with the driver. Amaka didn't like the idea, but Nnenna insisted. Few minutes later, Nnenna walked up to the conductor, who was eating in one corner of the room. She told him she was hungry and wants to eat food. The conductor looked at her from head to toe and licked his lips lasciviously. In his mind, he was imagining all the dirty things he would do to her. He knew she was a virgin, and he couldn't wait to pop her cherry. He also knew that he needed to feed her so she would have the energy for all he planned for her and her sister. He would have them both this night. He might even impregnate them and add them to his harem of wives in the village. He licked his lips again and smiled at her. Of course, beautiful princess. I will get you something to eat immediately. He stood up and went into the other room. When he left the room, Nnenna looked around and noticed that Amaka was no longer in the room. That meant that she had gone to talk with the driver. Nnenna's heart was pounding like a jackhammer. She hoped that their plan would work and they would be able to escape. She thought about their mother, who would be expecting them to come home after school. Their mother would be devastated if she learned that they had been captured. Thinking about their mother gave Nnenna the courage she needed to continue distracting the conductor. The conductor returned with a small loaf of bread a sachet of powdered milk, a cup, spoon, and a bottle of water. He placed them on the table beside him and asked Nnenna to sit down and eat. Nnenna sat down and ate her food. She cut the bread into two and wrapped the other half for Amaka. Suddenly, there was a scream from behind the house. It was Amaka's voice, and she was screaming, asking people to help her. Nnenna sprang up from her seat. She took the bottle of water and the bread and ran in the direction of Amaka's voice. Meanwhile, back in the tiny house, the shout had woken the passengers up. All of them sprang up on their feet and ran towards the same direction Nnenna ran. The conductor abandoned his food and chased after them. Nnenna kept running until she saw her sister and the driver struggling. The driver pinned Amaka to the ground with his weight and was trying to get in between her legs. Amaka was screaming, kicking, and fighting him with her strength. Immediately Nnenna saw what was happening. She looked around and saw a stone. She took the stone and ran with speed towards the driver. There was anger in her eyes. The conductor saw what Nnenna was about to do and ran towards her to stop it. Then the passengers saw that the conductor was trying to stop Nnenna, so they too ran after the conductor. They caught him and all of them pounced on him. They designed his body with all manner of blows until he couldn't stand up. They left him lying there and ran towards the conductor. Meanwhile, Nnenna was using the stone she picked to design the driver's body. The passengers got to her and joined her to design his body until he couldn't stand up. They carried him and laid him beside the conductor. One of the passengers got some strong leaves that they tied together to form a rope. Then they used the rope on their hands and legs. When they were all satisfied with their handwork, they all ran back to the tiny house and packed all their belongings. From the tiny house, they walked back to the van, and then one of the passengers drove the van back to the city. At the end of the day, Amaka and Nnenna got home to their mother, safe and sound, just as she had prayed.